Okay. Yeah, I think it's time to start now. Um, welcome to everyone to this Agrarian Change webinar. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, University of London, and I'll be chairing this session in which Haroon Akram-Lodhi will present and discuss the gender gap in agricultural productivity in Eastern and Southern Africa. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Rhea Senna from the University of Cambridge and Enrique Castagnon here from SOAS. The Agrarian Change seminar series is organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. You can find the full program of our webinars on our website, Agrarian Questions. The webinar is also live streamed on YouTube. Before we start, I just need to highlight some guidelines for participants. Firstly, please keep your microphone off, except when taking part in the discussion. Secondly, feel free to write questions and comments in the chat at any point in time. This is also the case for those of you that have joined us through our YouTube live stream. There's a chat function there too. In addition to that, in the question and answer sessions that follows after the presentation, those in the webinar can also ask live questions. Simply use the raised hand function. If you find this function, you'll find this function if you click on the participant button. And of course, when asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate and respectful. Finally, we're going to record both the audio and video of the session. So if you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. It is now time to welcome today's speaker, Professor Haroon Akram-Lodhi, who teaches agrarian political economy at Trent University in Canada. Thanks for joining us, Haroon.
Very welcome, Jens.
Thanks. Haroon is the editor-in-chief of the Agrarian Journal of Development Studies and an associate editor of Feminist Economics. His books include Hungry for Change, Farmers, Food Justice, and the Agrarian Question, and several co-edited volumes, including Peasants and Globalization, Political Economy, Rural Transformation, and the Agrarian Question. He is also co-editor of the forthcoming Edward Elgar Handbook of Critical Agrarian Studies. And he has published widely in academic journals, including in the Journal of Agrarian Change. So it's with pleasure that I welcome Haroon and his presentation on the gender gap in agricultural productivity in Eastern and Southern Africa, quantitative and qualitative determinants. Over to you, Haroon, for the next up to 50 minutes. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Jens. You may not say that by the time I get to the end, of course. So thanks, Yen, for the invitation to take part today. And also thanks everyone for attending, because I know that as the plague goes on, there's a certain degree of Zoom fatigue that is set in. So I really I'm very pleased for everyone to attend. I want to start, however, by telling everyone that I'm zooming in from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, or what is now known as Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on, learn from, and live in this land. Now, I want to start my presentation by situating the paper, which is that 29 years ago, which is for most of us in this webinar a very long time ago, after 7 years of work, I completed my doctorate on gender and class formation in northern Pakistan. In it, what I wanted to examine was how the gender division of labor did or did not contribute to agrarian differentiation and agrarian accumulation among small-scale petty commodity producers in northern Pakistan. I didn't use the language, but what I was exploring was the relationship between what today we would call social reproduction and class formation. If you want to put the same issue in more conventional language, though, I was exploring the issue of gender relations and their impact upon agricultural productivity. Fast forward 29 years, and I'm still paying attention to social reproduction and agricultural productivity. So why? The answer is fairly straightforward. Almost 3/4 of the world's poor live in the countryside, and a significant share of their livelihood is generated by farming. So boosting their productivity would improve their livelihood. And that's the reason why agricultural productivity growth is strongly correlated with economic growth and poverty reduction in primarily agrarian economies. But at the same time, since the early 1990s, women have constituted a growing share of the global farming population. If you like, the understudied intersection of social reproduction and agricultural productivity has become even stronger in the past 3 decades. The feminization of farming in the sub-Saharan African region led in the 1990s to a series of studies that used living standards measurement surveys to try and investigate whether there were significant differences in the agricultural productivity of women and men farmers. And this is what we call the gender gap in agricultural productivity. That even when you account for differences in land quantity and land quality, agricultural output per unit of land produced on land managed by women is less than that produced on land managed by men. The studies of the 1990s and the 2000s consistently showed that women farmers were less productive on the land they managed than men were on the land that they managed. Globally, the Food and Agriculture Organization has said that if women agriculturalists were as productive as men, total agricultural production in the world would rise by at least 30%. Now, I need to note that Cheryl Doss of Queen Elizabeth House at the University of Oxford has keenly demonstrated the pitfalls of attempting to estimate gender gaps in agricultural productivity, emphasizing in particular data gaps and respondent errors. Nonetheless, a range of existing studies indicate that women and men farmers, when making land management decisions, do not always face the same production conditions, nor do they always make the same production choices. It was in this light that the UNDP, UN Environment, Poverty Environment Initiative Africa, UN Women, and the World Bank together sought to quantify the gender gap in agricultural productivity in 3 Eastern and Southern African countries, Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda. I come into it in 2016 when I was asked to replicate this exercise for Ethiopia and for Rwanda. These exercises use integrated surveys of agriculture, which are built into some living standards measurement surveys. What makes these integrated surveys of agriculture interesting, and what makes these surveys address some but not all of the concerns of Cheryl Doss, is that rather than looking at the relative productivity of female versus male-headed households, as was done in the 1990s and the 2000s, these surveys identify the principal decision maker on plots of land on farms that are jointly operated by wives and husbands. So this means that this data set is not based upon male versus female-headed households. It includes these, but on farms that are jointly managed by husbands and wives, it is also possible to identify who makes decisions on specific plots of land. Is it the husband or is it the wife? Which means that these integrated surveys of agriculture have data sets which are far richer and far more observations than you find in conventional male versus female headed household estimates. Okay, Sharia, please go to the first slide. Okay. Please go to the next slide. There we go. I should say, for reasons I don't want to go into right now, the Rwanda estimates are not strictly comparable, but I've kept them here nonetheless for indicative purposes. The 2015 and the 2016 estimates suggest that taking into account that women operate smaller plots of land with poorer soils, that the gender gap in agricultural productivity between women and men operated plots in Eastern and Southern Africa ranged from 10% in Ethiopia to 31% in Malawi. Closing these gaps would increase total GDP by between $110 million and $419 million a year for 10 years in Malawi and Rwanda, respectively. And between 800,000 and 2.4 million people would be lifted out of poverty over 10 years in Tanzania and in Malawi, respectively. Also identified in the 2015 work and in my own 2016 work were the proximate statistical causes of the gender gap in agricultural productivity. These were found by using a Oaxaca blinder decomposition, which was in fact invented by Evelyn Kitagawa 20 years before Oaxaca or blinder did any decomposition. Please go to the next slide, Sharia. The most common findings across the 5 countries were that women managed plots of land had less access to male family labor than plots managed by men. This was far and away the most important statistical cause of the gender gap in agricultural productivity. Secondly, statistically, it was found that women made different crop choices than men. Women produced food security crops and men produced cash crops or higher value crops. Thirdly, it was found that men had better agricultural tools and implements than women managed plots of land. So female managed plots face different labor and different technological constraints in their farming decisions and choices. However, statistical significance, as in the 2015 and 2016 work, statistical significance does not necessarily produce results of economic significance. Indeed, the results need not be economically relevant or even economically plausible, because econometric correlations can only be based upon the data which is in the data set, which itself is a function of the questions that were asked in the integrated surveys of agriculture. So if an important question was not asked, it would not show up in the data. Or if the wrong person was asked the question, the data would not necessarily be correct. This is central to Cheryl Doss's critique of these statistical estimates. Therefore, the Poverty Environment Initiative and UN Women decided to investigate the 2015 quantitative findings by undertaking a qualitative assessment of the drivers of the gender gap in agricultural productivity in Malawi, Tanzania, and in Uganda. The purpose was to evaluate the extent to which the statistical results were witnessed on the ground. And I led this work. I haven't produced it for academic publication. Journal of Agrarian Change is one of the outlets in which I will produce this work for. But I have produced a large number of UN papers based upon this work. What I was asked to do essentially was to ask women and men themselves whether women were less productive than men, and if so, why women farmers were less productive than men farmers. We did the field work in 9 villages spread across 3 districts in Malawi, in 19 villages spread across 4 districts in Tanzania, and in 9 villages spread across 3 districts of Uganda. Facilitated by local district officials, in each village, semi-structured focus group discussions were followed by women's-only focus group discussions. This was then supplemented by desk reviews, a number of key informant interviews, and a series of workshops in each of the countries. The research team consisted of myself, along with women and men from UN system country organizations. Now, before I present the results of that work, I think it's important to clarify what we mean by work. In the system of national accounts that's used to construct estimates of gross domestic product and estimates of employment, work is defined as anything that you could theoretically pay someone else to do for you. One category of work is unpaid labor in family businesses. Now, in theory, this should capture women's responsibilities to contribute unpaid family farm labor. But frequently, it does not. Women's responsibility to provide unpaid family farm labor, particularly on men's plots, but also on joint plots, is not adequately captured in the integrated surveys of agriculture or in living standards measurement surveys. This is because the principal respondents in these surveys are most frequently men who do not recognize that their wives are working long periods on joint plots of land or on male-managed plots of land. In other words, men exaggerate their own work when it is their wives who are very often working alongside them or instead of them, and often contributing significantly more labor. Moreover, there is one exception to this rule defining work as anything that you could theoretically pay someone else to do for you. Labor services provided by members of a household for other members of a household are not counted as work, even though these two could theoretically be paid for. Labor services provided by members of a household for other members of a household are what we now call unpaid care and domestic work. This is, if you like, the contemporary manifestation of the core activities, not all of them, but the core activities of social reproduction. Unpaid care and domestic work is not counted as production and is not counted as employment, and thus do not show up in statistics. So living standards measurement surveys and integrated surveys of agriculture completely miss the performance of unpaid care and domestic work and the way in which it can intersect with and indeed structure the performance of farm work. The result of not counting unpaid care and domestic work is that a lot of activity doesn't count in the statistics as economic. And so subsistence work produced for the direct use of the home, or unpaid work in family businesses, or fuel and water collection are for the most part excluded from measures of gross domestic product. Housework such as cooking, washing, and household sanitation, childcare, elderly care, home health care, informal education within the home, these are excluded from estimates of employment. Now, some unpaid care and domestic work is, of course, extremely rewarding for the person doing it, such as looking after children. Some unpaid care and domestic work is extraordinarily burdensome for the person doing it, such as laundry. But all unpaid care and domestic work is socially necessary. In her new book, The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems, Nancy Folber puts it like this: the economic problem is not the allocation of scarce resources as in neoclassical economics, nor is it production as in classical economics. The crucial economic problem, Folber says, is the provision of care, because care creates the capabilities and hence labor capacities necessary to produce more and to be able to make allocative choices. So providing care raises children to assume their household and social responsibilities, and in so doing builds what we call in neoclassical economics human and social capital, or what we call in institutional economics human capabilities, while at the same time preparing people's capacities for quote unquote productive income generating activities during the day, which ensures the household's well-being. In other words, social reproduction through care is the precondition of production and accumulation. It's also important to recognize that unpaid care and domestic work has an opportunity cost. When doing unpaid care and domestic work, you are by and large not able to do another income generating activity. This means that work and income is foregone because of the requirements that unpaid care and domestic work be done. This also means that fewer people are available for the labor force because of unpaid care and domestic work requirements. These in turn affect growth in agriculture. In the short run, growth in agriculture is driven by demand, people buying goods and services. If income is foregone because people have to perform unpaid care and domestic work, demand is reduced. In the long run, growth in agriculture is driven by supply, the production of goods and services. This is a function of labor supply and technology, and hence productivity. But if people cannot work in the productive sense of the word, because they have to perform unpaid care and domestic work, then supply is in turn reduced. It's this conceptual approach that allows us to more closely examine the 2017 research findings and consider their consistency with the 2015 and 2016 quantitative results. Sharia, please go to the next slide. From the qualitative research, there were three key drivers of the gender gap in agricultural productivity. The first key driver, universally, was women's responsibilities to provide unpaid care and domestic work in the home and in the community, which reduced the amount of time that they could devote to their plots of land. This includes household maintenance, cooking, cleaning and care, and water and energy collection. And across the three countries in the villages where the research was done, this could very commonly account for between 5 and 7 hours of work a day. Now, because labor is a principal input into plot production and productivity, allocating time to unpaid care and domestic work impacts upon gender gaps in agricultural productivity by reducing labor inputs into farm production. The second driver from the qualitative research were women's responsibilities to provide unpaid contributing farm labor on plots of land principally managed by their husbands. Now, this further reduces the amount of time that women can devote to their plots. And once again, because labor is a principal input into plot production and productivity on women's plots of land, this impacts upon gender gaps in agricultural productivity by cutting labor inputs on women's plots of land. This was important because women's unpaid contributing farm labor on plots of land controlled by men was very widely present, not at all captured in any of the statistics, and also not identified in the policy-oriented literature. The third driver identified in the qualitative research across the villages of Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda were the physical injuries caused by gender-based violence, which reduced the amount of time that wives could spend on their plots of land. Gender-based violence was also used by some husbands to forcibly seize control of their wives' cash and crop resources. Now, this meant that gender-based violence reduced labor supply, acted as a disincentive to save, acted as a disincentive to invest, and also resulted in women needing to increase casual wage labor and petty trading to earn the money to make up for shortfalls that were a result of husbands seizing their cash. These are distinct economic consequences of gender-based violence that are, I find, remarkably little remarked about in both the policy literature, but also in the academic literature. Sharia, please go to the next slide. Thank you. So are the quantitative and the qualitative results consistent? Recall that there were three quantitative results. The first one overwhelmingly being that women's plots of land had inadequate quantities of male family labor to work on it. Now, in monogamous households, although women may work on joint plots of land, it's husbands who make decisions around crop choices and control the crop output without equitably sharing the proceeds from crop production. In the polygamous households, which were common in Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda, husbands were not willing to work on the plots of land that they assigned to their senior wives, and moreover expected their senior wives to work on their plots of land before any other on-farm operations were carried out, including work on women-managed plots. So both in monogamous and in polygamous household structures, husbands effectively managed wives' labor. This allowed men to have shorter working days on the farms than women, and for men to focus on their own or on joint plots, because from these plots of land, they controlled marketing decisions and the cash income that was generated. The second quantitative result was around crop choice mixes, with women producing different crops than men. Now, women have social responsibilities to provide food for the families, which impacts upon their crop choices, while men can control the output of their crops that they control and the incomes that they generate. So different decision-making powers over crops based upon social norms impacts upon crop choices. The third quantitative finding was that women managed plots and men managed plots used different technologies, with men managed plots having better agrarian technologies. Now here, women didn't have the cash incomes needed to buy any superior technologies because they had primary responsibility to meet household cash needs and provide for family cash requirements. And so household maintenance dominated women's use of cash incomes that they might have had. So the quantitative findings reflected social norms and values that generated the expectation that the meeting of household needs is the first and foremost responsibility of women. It was these social norms and values which in turn resulted in a gender-biased distribution of unpaid care and domestic work. It is these social norms and values that also resulted in the expectation that senior wives work on their husbands' plots of land or produce male-controlled cash crops on joint plots before they provide any labor on the plots of land that they themselves manage. So women face what some would call time poverty, having to do unpaid care and domestic work and work for others in maritally controlled plots of land or on their husbands' plots before they can work on any land which they themselves manage. These social norms and values, in turn, are enforced through the use by some men of gender-based violence, which has economic consequences in that it reduces women's labor availability, it reduces women's cash incomes, it acts as a strong disincentive to save, it acts as a strong disincentive to invest, all of which cumulatively impact upon the agricultural productivity of women's plots. Now, none of this is new. Sharia, please go to the final slide. None of this is new, but the continuing lack of attention to the intersection of social reproduction and production suggests that it is still very important for us to quite fundamentally rethink our analytical frameworks. And this is true whether you're working within an agrarian political economy approach, whether you're working within a more institutional approach, or indeed whether you're working in a neoclassical world. Social norms and values structure women's social reproduction labor and result in a lesser capacity to work both on farm and off farm. It is social reproduction then that results in gender-based differences in access to assets in inputs in the three countries where the research that was done. It was social reproduction that resulted in gender-based differences in labor, services, and technologies in the three countries where the research was done. It was social reproduction that resulted in gender-based differences in returns to assets and inputs in the three countries where the research was done. It was social reproduction that resulted in gender-based differences in agricultural productivity in Malawi, Tanzania, and in Uganda. Now, I've gone way under time. Before we came on today, I actually cut quite a lot out, thinking I was going to go over, and now I'm way under. Nonetheless, by way of conclusion, I want to note two analytical implications which could provide, particularly for agrarian political economy, an interesting basis for some of us to have a discussion in the time we've got left. The first analytical implication is this. Actually, I've got the time. Let me tell the story. Yeah, let me tell the story because I've got the time. In Uganda and in Malawi, when I was doing focus group discussions with men, I can remember very clearly sitting down with men and discussing farm production choices and decisions. This was in both countries where I was doing these specific conversations. These were very heavily polygamous households, and so the men had multiple wives. So the men were very open about the fact that they expected their wives to work on their land. In Malawi, it was to produce tobacco, an explicit cash crop. Um, so men were very open that women, the senior wives, were to work on their land to produce this cash crop, and they controlled the income from it. What was very interesting, however, that men were also very explicit in what they did with the cash incomes that were generated. In both Malawi and in Uganda, when wives worked on their husbands' plots, and then in these polygamous regions, when men controlled the incomes that were generated, the husbands would take the incomes that were generated by their wives' labor and invest it in acquiring a new wife to increase the labor force that was available to work on their land. In other words, marriage was a form of labor mobilization for the purposes of accumulation in these two communities where I had this discussion. In 1992, Henry Bernstein defined a labor regime as, quote, different methods of mobilizing labor and organizing it in production. I want to suggest to you that from a materialist perspective, perhaps we should start thinking about patriarchy as a form of labor regime. That gender relations mobilize labor both within the home and outside the home, organizing it for production, and that this could be a materialist way of thinking about patriarchal systems. The second analytical implication that I want to discuss, which is particularly appropriate for a webinar hosted at SOAS. Back in 1983, I hate to say it, back in 1983, when I took my first course in development economics from Terry Byers, I learned in that course the central importance of the marketable surplus in the process of structural transformation. But what I finally learned from the field work that I did in 2017 in Malawi, Tanzania, and in Uganda is what to now is, to me, an obvious point, that what is and what is not surplus is defined by the patriarch who controls the resources of the rural household. And what is surplus to the patriarch may not be surplus to other members of the household. In this sense, the surplus is itself a gendered concept. And I would put it to you that this is something that I have not seen explicitly explored in any of the literature. So these two analytical implications that I raise mean to me that research into gender and agricultural productivity, or if you like, research into the intersection and interface of social reproduction with production, still has the potential to engage us in quite fundamental questions of agrarian political economy. As I said, I'm under time because I cut things out, but that's perfectly okay. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Haroon. Excellent presentation, really interesting. Thanks. We will move on straight away. And this week I have asked for this seminar. I've asked Bridget O'Loughlin to comment on the presentation instead of me saying whatever I can say. So hopefully that will increase quality significantly. But before I'm handing over to you, Bridget, let me just reiterate that we are now entering into the question and answer session, and people can raise their hands through Zoom, or they can write comments or questions in the chats that are available as well. But I will, without any further pronouncing from my side, I will hand over to Bridget. I might return in the question and answer session myself. Bridget, over to you.
Thanks, Jens, and thanks very much to you. In fact, you went quickly, and I don't think I've got it really all straight down in my mind. But since my role is just to start off with questions, that I can do. And you can either correct before we all start, or we can listen to what everybody else also has to ask. So the first thing I will tell you, when I hadn't actually heard any of what you did, and I thought about it, I saw the title, and it was The Gender Gap in Productivity in Eastern and Southern Africa. And so what I actually thought we were going to be looking at was the old question of migrant labor and the women who, for a major part of the period of development of a household, are actually both managing and working. Yeah. So although you focused on the places where that's not such, except for Malawi, where it is, but except for Malawi, the other two are less known for that. But as a reservation question, I think it's useful to think about. The second thing that I wondered about was, okay, what's going to be the measure of productivity? Because that's always such a question for us who are involved in agrarian issues. You take the productivity of land as the measure of productivity, but that's not, after all, what one does in a capitalist enterprise. You're looking in different ways at the productivity of labor. Yeah. And so the question that I would raise is, well, what if we think that the issue that we're actually dealing with is the productivity of labor? And from a political economy perspective, what if we do not take the measure of productivity of labor to be necessarily the wage? Yeah. Because implicit in much of the methodology for estimating what, in fact, the productivity of labor is, we're imputing a wage in terms of the value. Yeah. So those issues are, I thought, well, it's worthwhile to think a little bit about them as well. Then the third one is, about this qualitative and quantitative division. Do we really mean what we can measure by measuring wage movements? I don't actually see why, looking at the time that women spend in doing various activities, or the work they do that is not paid, cannot be counted. It's a quantitative question. It's different to what we look at when we can depend on what a capitalist tells us and look at profit margins. But it's all important because you're trying to understand poverty. And who says that poverty, the experience of poverty, is just about wage income? It's also about the experience of work, how much work you do, under what terms. So it seems to me, important to think about, when you're thinking about, new methodologies for raising this question, to think about looking at labor directly in various ways. So rather than calling one social reproduction, yeah, And you don't count that, that's qualitative. And then the other is production, that's quantitative, we can count it. But if we are looking at how poverty develops, what the experience is like, can't we look at both? Isn't that part of what our mandate should be? Of course, that's not the same thing as explaining what it is that leads to accumulation of capital. And then the next question is, well, what about resistance? All those things that, the senior men would tell you when you ask them, isn't that the world they'd like? Do women necessarily do those things? In other words, not only does violence against women affect what women do, so does women's resistance to the tasks that they have and putting in somewhere else. They're not automatically utilitarians, but neither are men, as you can tell by the way they spend their time. Anyway, so there are some assumptions or questions that I think we might ask. And finally, of course, we've during my whole adult life, I take that back, academic life, more or less, this whole question of what is the relationship between gender and class? And is gender not really a relation of production? Has been a question which comes back and eats and eats. What are the disadvantages of it? What are the advantages of it? That all matters. So those were some of the questions that I had as I, both thought about what you might say, which is not necessarily what you did say, but also as we went through this. But I'm sure that I lost a lot along the way. But I think other people will have heard things that I didn't catch or have forgotten already. There's one of the artifacts of aging,
Oh, well.
So let's open it up.
Yeah, we all getting older, but maybe also wiser, some of us at least. Let us. I think we should give everyone a chance to reflect on some of these issues. I mean, there are 5 big issues here, and I wouldn't expect you to reflect on all of them, but pick some of them now, and then we can return to some of them later as well. I also know from my co-hosts that there already are questions both on YouTube and of course on the chat here. So and Steve now indicates he also would like to ask a question. So we're well on our way. But Haroon, first, let us hear your reflections on these issues.
Well, thanks very much, Anna. Thank you, Bridget. As ever, always very illuminating reflections or concerns, maybe not the word, things to consider. Jens, I'll deal with all 5 of them actually briefly, if I may, because we've got tons of time. So, and let me deal with them in order. The first one being the migrant labor question. It certainly is true that in Malawi, there is, of course, migrant labor circulation across the region historically. And so that would be something that we brought into thinking about women's roles in managing and working land. But I think more generally across, Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda, the migrant labor issue is really, in many ways, about men urbanizing in search of waged work and women being left. And that is certainly very, very common in the regions. Now, the thing about these integrated surveys of agriculture is that they do actually allow you to pick up on those forms of household structure. And so it is possible to look at issues around households and reproduction that's taking place when there are absent males in the households. But that certainly was not something that was part at all of the 2015 quantitative work that was done primarily by the World Bank and it certainly wasn't the work that I was asked to lead back in 2016. But it is something which, again, if you were to write this up and you were to do it from an academic point of view, as opposed to the global institutional point of view, that is something that you'd want to bring into it. Second issue, yes, on the productivity question, the productivity of land versus the productivity of labor. Well, the estimates of productivity that were used in these quantitative estimates are based upon the imputed value of the total production produced per unit of land. And you're absolutely right that productivity per unit of land as a measure is not a capitalist measure. And what you would want to look at is the productivity of labor. And in fact, this is something that it's not as if that kind of a comment is not something which is not something of which I'm not completely aware, because if I go back to the 1992 dissertation, when I used the productivity measures, when I did the work in northern Pakistan, I did productivity per unit of land, but I also did it productivity per unit of labor that was applied. And in principle, I could go back and I could look at this information. We could go back and look at the information, trying to estimate labor productivity, which in fact would be quite an interesting question to get a more comprehensive understanding around the issue of productivity. I suppose what I would then say is the reason that wasn't done was instrumentalist reason. I wasn't asked to do it, which doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, because of course the productivity of labor is absolutely central to understanding structural transformation. The third question on counting unpaid work. Absolutely. Production is quantitative, social reproduction is qualitative. This is quite a misleading approach. I totally agree. Unpaid work can, of course, be counted, and unpaid work of different types should be counted, using various kinds of instruments, because you're totally right that poverty is not just about cash income or incomes that are generated on land, but it's about the total experience of work. But I don't need to tell you the fact that the reality is that measures for counting unpaid work, of course they all exist, but what that then requires is much more finely grained, detailed field work, which does construct proper time use diaries on the relationship between unpaid work and revenue generating or income generating or cash generating or formal employment, waged labor, informal waged labor, whatever. But something which captures the greater totality of work requires much more finely grained field work using proper survey instruments. And I mean, I've done that work myself, so I'm completely aware of that as an issue. So I'm not suggesting at all that what you're saying is what I am saying is what you're saying is completely correct, and it should be done. But as much as you can talk to people around the world around the importance of trying to quantitatively capture the dynamics of unpaid work and how the dynamics of unpaid work intersect with paid work, we can't even get proper estimates for this in the United Kingdom or in the Netherlands or in Canada consistently, let alone in developing countries. So that is something which requires an awful lot more work on. Resistance. Do women resist? Absolutely, they resist. And I in doing the field work, I came across some quite remarkable examples of resistance. And there's one, I like telling anecdotal stories. I don't know why, but I do. But there's one anecdote that I would tell you from Western Tanzania, when I was specifically taken to interview a women's group. And this women's group, 14 women, had off of their own sent a letter to the president of Tanzania asking that the president allocate them land as a group. And for whatever reason that unbeknownst to me, the president of Tanzania did allocate them land. And then this, when the women got this land, they didn't tell their husbands where the land was. And this then gave them an independent source of production and an independent source of income. And this had really quite transformative effects. So with the independent income, the relative positions in the households really changed quite fundamentally. So when I asked the 14 women, the members of this group, whether in an area that was rife with polygamous marriage, whether any of their husbands had other wives, everyone said no, that they were all in monogamous households, which was, hugely interesting because it was, atypical of the region. And then the second thing I asked them was about cash incomes from the plots of land that were jointly managed, and they said that their husbands shared the incomes that were generated in an equitable way. The third thing that was noticeable is that of the 14 women, when I asked them, they all said to me that none of their husbands subjected them to gender-based violence. And it's also interesting that with the money that the earnings that the women generated from their independent source of land, they did two principal things. The first thing was they invested in their children's education, as a result of which, of the 14 women, 3 of them had daughters who had gone to college, and 1 of them had a daughter who had gone to university, which was really quite something. And all 14 of them had also built a place for themselves in an urban setting, because in an urban setting, they felt freer to be able to live a life that they wanted. So there was this form of, group mobilization. In other field work sites, there was quite explicit resistance, particularly in northern Tanzania when I was doing field work there. So there was certainly explicit resistance going on to the gender-based violence that was being witnessed. And then finally, to your 5th point, I'm not going to answer this, but I'm just going to highlight the fact that this is the proverbial question, gender and class. How do we understand the relationship between gender and class? This is something which I know you know, and I know that I know we can spend a lifetime trying to sort through and not particularly come to a suitable or a conclusive answer. But as we go along, perhaps we learn a little more as we do. I certainly think that it's very useful in many areas that I've worked in Asia and in Eastern Africa to think of gender as a relation of production, because of the extent to which men very often control, through various means, women's labor. And I think then that is a useful framework for thinking about it. But gender and class is something which, we all should pay far more attention to. And even as we pay more attention to it, all we get are more questions. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Well, I guess one can also put that question by asking whether gender is usefully reduced to class, or whether it encompasses class plus. But that I will leave for now. And I thought we should go on to the chat here. We have a fair few questions from the chat. So if one of my co-hosts could give us a summary of at least some of the questions in the chat here.
Jens, I can do that. So thank you for the talk, Harun. That was very interesting, and we do have some reactions in the chat. So I'm going to take the first 3 questions. The first one comes from Jonathan, and he asked if you could say a little bit more about the differences between the villages depending on proximity to urban labor markets, issues of commuting, migration, those sort of things. And perhaps if you can expand a little bit more on how the surplus is gendered. So that's from Jonathan. Then we have a question from Shruti. Shruti asked if your findings regarding the causes of the productivity gaps were consistent across households belonging to different socioeconomic classes. And another one from Ali. He points out that tribes are the leadership position in tribes are usually occupied by men. So he wants to elaborate if men receive agricultural or financial advantage as being part of tribes. I mean, what's sort of the role of the tribal structure in this sort of dynamics? And also, he would like to know if women have lower quality of land than men. Why is this the case?
So, Haroon, would you like to answer or give us your views on these ones?
Sure. The relationship of the villages to urban labor markets. What I would say is that for the most part, the villages were within a commuting distance of a regional town, which tended to be not very large. And so urban labor markets did not necessarily structure particularly men's labor allocation decisions, in the sense that when they decided to migrate, they would decide to migrate to a large urban area, and then they were basically, they were gone. But what there was, particularly in Malawi, where there's a number of cash crops for export being generated in one area where I did field work, there was the availability of rural waged labor working in the formal sector, and those were very desirable jobs to be had. But in the village where I was doing that work, it was only a small number of men that worked for the multinational company that was doing that. The second aspect of the question is to say a little bit more about how the surplus is gendered. Well, one of the things, that was implanted upon me was the key role of the net marketed surplus when we think about surpluses. So surpluses which households don't need for immediate consumption, for future consumption, or as possible working capital in the future for the farm, and which could be made available to be sold in markets. Less, of course, expenses. But the thing about this then is that in many households, in the majority of households, the decision about whether crops are going to be marketed is a decision which is very commonly made by men. And so men are the ones are deciding whether the crop production is surplus to household requirements. And certainly in some circumstances, when I had conversations with husbands and then separately with wives, they would tell me that the men were selling crops which the household needed in order to maintain food consumption. So what this says to me is that because men very often control marketing, their evaluation of what is and what is not surplus may be very different from what women decide is and is not surplus, because they're producing for different reasons and they have different responsibilities over crop disposal. And so that's what I mean when I say we need to start thinking about the extent to which the surplus itself is gendered. And I have to say that this is something that when it came to me in 2017, when I thought about it, as soon as I thought about it, it became perfectly obvious that we should always think about this, because it's about how crops are marketed, number one, and that is gendered. But it also said to me that this has the potential to really make us rethink how we even understand the sort of classical story of the role of the surplus in structural transformation. because we've approached it, when we think of it from a macro perspective, in a way which isn't gendered. And I think that's something which really requires thinking about a lot more. It's not going to be me that does that, but certainly I'm very well aware of this now. Now, in terms of the consistency of the drivers of gender gaps across households of different classes, I think it's important to stress that the quantitative analysis did not do any kind of class analysis, which would be based upon looking at the assets available to households and in some way stratifying those households based upon their assets, and then examining whether or not household production, decision-making, resource bases, decision-making, and outcomes were different based upon those asset bases. That wasn't done. What I would say is that this role of unpaid care and domestic work was common across households regardless of income levels, which isn't class, but is indicative of possibly what one might find if one did a class-based analysis. And also the role of women in working on, as unpaid, working on plots of land where the decisions were made by their husbands, whether they're joint or male managed plots, that this was also something which was found across different income groupings as well. And certainly in Malawi and in Uganda, households that were accumulating, what we saw was that the role of unpaid care and domestic work and contributing farm labor on male plots was uniform across accumulating households and those which were producing much lower levels of cash incomes. Third, men and women, qualities of land. Yes, very typically, women had poorer qualities of land. This in polygamous households, which in many of the communities were the majority of households, men deliberately assigned senior wives lower quality of land because this was land that was designed to feed families rather than for marketable cash crop or flex crop production. So women had lesser qualities of land. They also had smaller plots of land as well. And then the final one in the third intervention was, is there a financial, I didn't quite get it, Enrique. Is there a financial advantage to being a member of a tribe? Sorry, could you read that first one of the third one again to me? I didn't quite understand.
Sure, no problem. So Ali comments and says, men are part of tribes and tribes leaders are usually men. So do men receive an agricultural or financial advantage if they are part of a tribe?
Well, men and, tribal relations differ quite profoundly across the different villages in which the work was done, number one. Number two, it's usually, and I prefer to use the word communities rather than to use the word tribe. It's usually local communities which are responsible for overseeing land which is accessed by households and which is held in common. But when I say communities oversee it, I mean they don't intervene in it. They may intervene if there's a death, but generally speaking, when it comes to land, which is the principal input in the villages where I was doing the field work, men would say of communal land for which they did not have title, which was controlled in theory by the community, men would say that they owned the land. Yeah, that was the word they consistently used, that they owned it, even though they didn't have any kind of formal title. And what they meant was that they would be able, that many of them had inherited land that had been worked by their forebears, and they would pass that land on. And that was a result of the way in which community structures operated. But I don't really like talking, especially across quite heterogeneous communities, around this issue of thinking about tribes. Okay.
let us move on to Stephen Biggs, who had a hand up early on. So let's hear your question, Steve. Question, comment.
Haroon, thank you so much for such an interesting talk. First is an observation. It's about data collection and data analysis. And for me, some of this was going back to debates of the 70s of it's not one of quantitative versus qualitative. It's one of good qualitative work or good quantitative work. And it seems, for me, and clearly you as well, who were trained in both econometrics, in census collection, all of the agricultural economics conventional and survey methods, as well as qualitative methods, because in the 70s they were very much recognized as what we seem to have come on to now is where some of the work by the World Bank or by the people handling census data or handling big data now, because there are big data sets becoming available and time series big data sets, they're being analyzed from my perspective with techniques and tools and ways which are kind of don't recognize their limitations. So they're trying to get more from inappropriate use of their data sets. And you've also got a whole lot of qualitative studies which are making assumptions about generalities or macro implications which can't be really drawn from micro careful studies. So my observation of having been recently involved in some big work on mechanization in Asia and lessons for African countries, those issues have come up writ large. So I would urge you as an observation that you need to be writing articles in standard agricultural economics journals or in standard journals which are using data sets quite often inappropriately or beyond what. So that's the observation and support. The question for me is as I've been involved more recently in looking at rural mechanization and agricultural mechanization in especially South Asian countries of Thailand, Bangladesh, Nepal, where there's in recent years been very substantial mechanization, especially the spread of smaller scale engines, really small engines, whether they be hand tillers, two-wheel tractors, small pump sets for irrigation, pump sets on the back of bicycles, you name it. You've got a whole mechanization process taking, which isn't the kind of conventional large-scale tractors, etc. There's a phenomenal amount of diversity, which isn't being recorded much. That diversity, especially amongst small. So my question to you is whether this, is a small scale of mechanization with markets and services, which in Asia, you never not have markets in engine services, water markets, tillage market, you name it. Whether in your observation in some Africa, where you've been working recently, whether any of these processes are taking place perhaps very rapidly, but not being observed because they are so recent, and studies are, well, especially census or any other data, is always really out of date? So that's a question.
Okay, so that's quite a lot to respond to, Steve. So I'll try and deal with the observation and the question because it's quite interesting. I mean, Steve, obviously, I completely agree with you that the issue isn't whether it's quantitative or whether it's qualitative, it's whether it's good. And I also completely agree with you that even when there are so many problems with the sort of bog standard surveys of the sort that were used for the quantitative estimates for this work, the integrated surveys of agriculture. There are quite fundamental problems that exist in some of these large data sets, which does affect the efficacy of what you're able to generate from them. The obvious point, which I don't really get it. The neoclassical economists that work at the World Bank and at Swedish SIDA back when they were originally developed, it has to be said, who were responsible for the introduction of living standards measurement surveys, and then responsible for the introduction of integrated surveys of agriculture. Their training is one based upon methodological individualism. And yet, when they go out and when they develop initially these large-scale surveys to get better understandings of consumption, consumption and well-being, they use the household. And then, the assumption behind this is that the person that they're talking to, the head of the household, whoever that may be, actually knows what everyone else is doing in the household. I don't know about your household, Steve, but in my household, that's quite a heroic assumption on the best of times. And yet you're supposed to have a really good idea of being able to figure this out. So fundamentally, a lot of, I remember, God, his name's gone out of my head. He used to be at SOAS, Jonathan, who worked on Indonesia. It's gone out of my head.
Jonathan Pincus.
Pincus. Thank you. The day he got his post, I went to the bar with him. Jonathan Pincus used to say that these living standards measurement surveys are extraordinarily weak evidentiary bases upon which to do any kind of serious analysis. And on that, he is totally right. So that is, if you like, I'm fully well aware of that. And indeed, I've written on the weaknesses of these sorts of instruments. Nonetheless, I do think that, if you look at data sets which are consistently collected across locations in a consistent way, and you look for patterns or regularities, you can make inferences, not conclusions, but inferences which can guide you in what you might want to examine. Okay, so I'm not at all disagreeing with the fact that you want good quality quantitative data and good quality qualitative data. Much of the quantitative data that we use in rural development is unless it's micro collected by you and you're very, very confident of it, you should be very careful about it. And indeed, and I used to teach this stuff back quite a while ago now. I always made my students, when they were starting to look at these big data sets, actually look at how the data is collected, what's the process of data collection, what are the possibilities for errors, how reliable is it. I actually made them develop sections in their writing where they had to justify the use of these data sets, and they didn't like doing it. They just didn't like doing it. They'd much rather be handed the data and say, this is reliable. But I could tell you some real horror stories about huge data sets which have been used to inform, tens of millions of dollars of development spending. So, and I also agree with you that there is a lot of qualitative work which is based upon fairly erroneous assumptions about macro level processes. I would agree with that. And I think part of this, I'm going on a bit too long here. I think part of this, though, is a change in peasant studies, a change in the study of agrarian change, in which so much research back in the 70s and the 80s looked at a combination of data with field observation. If we look at the classic sort of you know, a lot of that classic work. You combine the two of them to try and get understandings. But what we've got now is a divorce between those who do the big data, who don't understand the qualitative, those who do the qualitative. Far too often, you know, they don't use much in the way of data. When they do it quite in quite an elementary way. So one has to be careful. I'll take your advice on publishing in conventional agricultural economic journals on board, but I hesitate to say this is highly unlikely to happen. So on the issue of mechanization, I mean, you know, I could go about mechanization for a long time, because what you're talking about that you've observed, in fact, I observed in the early 2000s in Vietnam, and in particularly in when you could actually be in a car driving on the roads, and when you crossed provincial borders in Vietnam, you could actually tell differences in living standards because of the extent to which small scale machinery all of a sudden became present in particular jurisdictions, just as you crossed notional borders. It's quite remarkable. So these small scale machinery and the diversity of them, you know, part and parcel of Vietnam's agrarian transition. And I do actually mention this in my 2005 Agrarian Change article. So I'll just leave it at that. But where I was doing the field work, there was very limited mechanization. In some parts of northern Tanzania, there was a very small amount of it, and it wasn't small scale, it was tractors that I would see. But the people who owned those, I didn't talk to. It has to be said. They didn't want to have that kind of a conversation. For the most part, what I was looking at remained very labor intensive, small scale petty commodity production. The principal input difference, I would say, that what would be observed was one in which some people had been able to generate more reliable access to water, and so were not always reliant simply on rain, because these were rain-fed areas. But I did go to some places where foot pumps were used, and wells had been dug down to the water table, and those farmers were producing horticultural crops for sale in markets, and were doing fairly well out of it. But they hadn't gotten even to the point of buying a motor for the pumping. There's one exception to that, but the one exception that I've got is one that wasn't included as part of the research. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. Well, we will look out for you in the standard journals, but we shall see. First, though, I think it's time for us to go to the chat on YouTube, and I think Shreya will tell us more what's going on there.
Hi, thanks, Jens. So we have this one question from Clementine, who's asking, you mentioned a few literature gaps. Why do you think there has been a lack of research into gender and agriculture, especially in the gendered management of surpluses? And there are quite a few questions on Zoom, so I think I'm just going to ask a few of them, and then if we have time, we can come back to some of the others. So Vivian has asked, where insecure land rights exist, does this affect women or men's productivity? What could be the differences, if any? Thanish has asked, when you mentioned that women's social responsibility for household care leads to them choosing food crops instead of more profitable cash crops that men grow, just made me wonder if you had come across instances of communal work where single female households formed communities amongst themselves to share labor and care responsibilities, so that perhaps they could focus on both subsistence crops and cash crops. Caitlin's question is that, I'm wondering if there are limits to thinking predominantly in terms of accumulation. What kinds of relations and dynamics outside of economic production matter in terms of why or how gender functions as a relation of power and intersects with other things like age and lineage? For instance, how can we also account for how a desire for authority, legitimacy, social status, etc., are also driving the ways in which agricultural activity is structured, and what effects that structuring has? So maybe I'll just stop here and then we can come back to the other questions.
Thanks, Freya.
Okay, well, again, lots. Why are, Clementine, why are there literature gaps? I'll tell you what I find quite remarkable for a literature gap. And that is the one that I mentioned, which are on thinking around consequences of gender-based violence. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that one should reduce gender-based violence to the merely economic, because that would be a travesty. But the fact that there is so little research done on the economic dimensions of gender-based violence and how power can be used to materially control resources, I find this really quite remarkable. Now, Nata Duvray has done some work on this in a number of places, and we have talked extensively about this kind of work because, you know, when we think about violations of rights around violence, we very often think about them as a violation of individual civil and political rights. But what about the violation of your economic rights, that, you know, your husband can take your resources, and if you don't give them your resources, you may be beaten, you know? And in both Uganda, there was a particular example where it was quite common for husbands to go into women's grain stores, which were responsible for feeding the family, and they would take in their galoshes, and this is the word that was used, galoshes, the rain boots, and they would fill their rain boots with grain, go down to the market, sell the grain, and then go off and see their friends and drink. And there was actually a phrase for doing this that women talked about quite a lot. And this, you know, this seizure of resources really would reduce any kind of incentive to store your resources, you know, or if you are going to store them, you're going to try and hide them so that they can't be seized, especially if this is widely prevalent in a particular community. The fact that women who are injured are less able to work is something which does affect the way in which an economy operates, and yet there's very little research done on labor supply consequences of gender-based violence. You know, these sorts of things I just find really quite remarkable. And I think if I were to say why there are these gaps, I think in the conventional economics literature, it's because, you know, this isn't considered an economic problem in the conventional literature. But why this work isn't done in the heterodox economics literature, I'm not really sure at all. So there are these significant gaps. I would also say that sometimes these gaps can be quite nuanced. So, for example, women's unpaid contributing labor on family farms. In Uganda, Tanzania, and in Malawi, there is nothing in the policy literature on this. But there is stuff in the academic literature, which indicates the extent to which there can be a real disconnect between the academic literature and the policy literature. And that why that there's not more of an informing of one with the other is not clear to me. Okay, so the Zoom questions. The first one about insecure land rights. Well, in the areas where I was doing this research, land was held customarily, but land was not insecure, in the sense that you know, land was inherited, land was inheritable, and even common property did have the potential to be rented out, and in some instances could even be sold, but only for the use right sold for a period of time. So, you know, the men themselves where they said they owned the land, even though they didn't formally own it. They had no sense of insecure property rights. And I think, it's very, very easy for us to think around issues of property, but, and rights around property, but we have to recognize that people's understanding of property rights are very socially embedded. And what is understood as a property right in the United States is not necessarily the same kind of an understanding of a property right in Uzbekistan, or a property right in Uruguay, or wherever. So one has to be fairly nuanced around that. Now, was there any examples of communal groups that moved beyond food crops? Well, the Tanzanian example that I provided was exactly that. The Ambani Women's Group, as a group mobilization, working communally, in which they shared their caring responsibilities, and they used their collective caring responsibilities to think in terms of how they allocated the work that had to be done on the land that they operated. And having said that, the proceeds of the land that they collectively or communally operated were individually allocated. But there was that particular example. The final comment: does thinking about gender in terms of accumulation limit our thinking around it, because gender is a relation of power? I think this is a conversation that is one which is well worth having over a much more prolonged discussion. But what I would put to you is, power, sure, is about authority, legitimacy, sure. But one should recognize the extent to which authority is very often rooted in material circumstances, that the control of assets and the control of incomes, and an inability to have secure sources of support outside household bases of assets and incomes, that these can be sources of power in a household, and that social norms that structure this do affect how authority is deployed. So there may be limits to thinking about gender and as something to do with accumulation, but I would actually put it to you in the reverse: to think about authority and legitimacy as expressions of power without bringing in material bases to those power is extraordinarily limited, because much power has a material basis. And I think far too much gender analysis fails to locate material bases of gendered expressions of power, just as far too many people that look at the material basis of power fail to look at their gendered expressions.
See, that could be a good place to stop, but we're not stopping yet, because there's still questions, which is great. It seems today we mainly get questions in through the chats. People are less happy to ask questions in person, but please do so. So if you want to, we're reaching the end of the 2 hours soonish. So if you want to, it's time to raise your hand. But for now, I think we should go back to the chat. And Shreya, would you mind taking us through the chat again?
Yeah, I think we have a set of questions from Ina, who's saying thank you very much. So the first question is, do these studies about increasing agricultural production take into account the fact that women's unproductive plots that are primarily used for subsistence are as necessary as the cash crop plots that are supposed to drive economic development and increase GDP? The second question is, do they take into account that cash income from men's plots or even joint plots could in many cases be seized by men and used primarily for personal consumption or alcohol consumption, as noted in many studies in Latin America and the South Pacific? And as such, this cash income then cannot meet subsistence needs. And the third question is from Ina is that, and from your answer that men may see a large portion of crops as surplus, but women say that these were needed for subsistence, I wonder if the development attempts to increase productivity miss the point that people's lives will not improve as a result of larger volumes of production, especially of cash crops. So I suppose the policy implication of your gendered understanding of surplus. Thanks, Jens.
Okay, so Enya, I think the name was Shreya, right? I think I can answer those fairly straightforwardly. These studies, well, this research was based on the proposition that food crops from women's plots are as important, or in many cases more important than cash crops, because these provide the guarantee that allow cash crop production to go forward. So it was certainly one in which, you know, the way in which cash was generated was not seen as the sole metric of economic success. Did we take account of the? Did I take account of the fact that cash income was seized by men? Absolutely, I did. Once I found out that this was going on, which happened fairly early on in the research, I started consistently asking it across all the communities that I was doing the research, because this is something which is really, really important. The fact that that not just cash incomes, but also stored crops designed for food security can be seized. Now, but the third question is really the most important one of these three. You know, should we pay attention to agricultural productivity? You know, is increasing productivity the answer? The first point that really has to be stressed is general development nostrums which suggest improve agricultural productivity say nothing at all about how the fruits of that improved productivity will be distributed within the household. And until one gets a better understanding of how the benefits of productivity improvements are distributed, it's not possible to say whether an improvement in productivity benefits all or benefits one. It's perfectly capable of, one is perfectly capable of going through a thought experiment in which there's a huge productivity improvement, and as a consequence of this, the male within a household controls all of that improvement for their own gain, and everyone else remains in exactly the same position. So general nostrums about improving productivity certainly miss a very important dimension of distribution of gains, which I think is something which is very important to highlight. Having said that, recognizing the fact that around the world, small-scale petty commodity production is increasingly a feminized activity, increasing the productivity of those women farmers who are primarily responsible for meeting, firstly, the food needs of their households, and then secondly, generating cash for their households. This remains tremendously important. And in some instances, improvements to productivity can be done in very straightforward ways. They don't require complex technological solutions. In many instances, better management of scarce water could bring about significant productivity improvements. And the fact that better management of scarce water remains something which you don't see often enough is still something which I find really quite interesting. That far too many governments want high-tech water solutions rather than thinking of some really cheap solutions. There was one community where I did research where they had done a very cheap tech solution and it worked remarkably. So these can be very, very important.
Thanks. Now, we have a comment from Caitlin, but we have no more questions. And I wonder if this is the time we should draw this to a close. And thank Haroon for this wonderful presentation, the very clear empirical findings and the clear conclusions that you drew on the basis of them were really interesting, as were the wider theoretical, analytical considerations, and not the least the political considerations in relation to this. And I think the discussions really covered an excellent sight of important issues and through those markers and pointers out here for all of us to think about. So thanks a lot, Haroon, and I think it's been enjoyable and excellent 2 last hours we've had here. So thanks. I will, as the only one who can do this and be heard, I will give you a hand. Thanks. Let me also, before we finish, let me say that our next webinar will actually be already in a week's time, this time around, and it will continue some of the strands we have gone into here, as Lynn Awesome from the Institute of Economic Justice in Johannesburg will present on the agrarian question of gendered labor. So we all looking forward to that. I am at least. But for now, I will say thanks to everyone and hopefully see you back next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, okay, Jens, I just was waiting for the